Before the histories were written, before the philosophies of Greece or the legions of Rome, was a world of bronze and gold. A world of great kings who called each other brother, of palaces that touched the clouds, and of ships that stitched countenance together with threads of tin and copper. It was the first truly globalized world, humming with the energy of a dozen cultures, 1,000 cities. It felt eternal. It felt invincible, but it was not. In the space of a single lifetime, this brilliant world was consumed by fire and chaos. The palaces burned, the cities fell silent, the kings vanished. An entire age of humanity was wiped from the memory of the earth, leaving behind only ruins, myths, and a chilling mystery. What was it that brought down the giants of the Bronze Age? And who were the shadowy figures who came from the sea, leaving only destruction in their wake? Join us as we journey back more than 3,000 years to uncover the story of a world that was lost and to understand the echoes of its collapse that still resonate today. Our story begins not in a throne room nor on a battlefield, but far to the east, in the shadow of immense, windswept mountains. Here, under a relentless sun, men toil in the earth, searching for a soft, silvery white metal. It is not gold, nor is it silver, but it is nearly as precious. It is tin. From this remote place, the metal is loaded onto the backs of donkeys, beginning a journey that will span a continent. For weeks, the caravan trudges through dusty plains and treacherous mountain passes, a lifeline of civilization moving at the pace of a patient beast. This slow, arduous journey is the first link in a chain that holds an entire world together. A world of bronze. For without this tin, the copper mined on distant islands is a little more than a soft, decorative metal. But when the two are brought together in the crucible's fire, an alchemical transformation occurs. They become bronze, the sinew of armies, the edge of the farmer's plow, the substance of art, and the foundation of power. The entire age is named for it, and that age is built upon journeys just like this one. The world of the late Bronze Age, for all its soaring ambition and monumental architecture, is balanced on the back of a donkey, walking 1,000 miles. Caravan's destination is the coast of the Levant, the eastern shore of the great Mediterranean Sea. It arrives at a city humming with a constant, vibrant energy. This is a place like Ugarit, a jewel of trade, a crossroads where the world comes to meet. Here the air is thick with the scent of cedarwood, exotic spices, and the salt of the sea. In the sprawling markets, you can hear a dozen languages spoken. A merchant from Crete with his distinctive Minoan kilt haggles over the price of wine with a Babylonian agent. An Egyptian official, clad in white linen, inspects a shipment of lapis lazuli that has traveled even farther than the tin dot in the workshops of the city. Artisans craft intricate furniture of ivory and gold, destined for the palaces of kings. In the scribal quarters, men sit hunched over clay tablets, writing in several different scripts. One scribe uses the wedge-shaped cuneiform of Mesopotamia to record a trade deal. Another uses the elegant hieroglyphs of Egypt for a diplomatic message. And a third uses a revolutionary invention, a simple alphabet, to keep the warehouse inventories. This city does not belong to a single empire. It belongs to the world. It thrives on connections, a vital node in a network that stretches from the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf. Ships from Cyprus, laden with raw copper, dock alongside vessels from Egypt, their holds filled with grain and papyrus. Ugarit is a testament to what this age has achieved, a shared system of commerce, culture, and communication. It is a world built on trust, on treaties, and on the predictable rhythms of trade from the docks of Eucharit. Our shipment of tin is loaded onto a sturdy, square-sailed ship. It joins ingots of copper, shaped like ox hides for easier carrying, and sets a course west, toward the isles of the Aegean. The ship sails across the wind-dark sea, navigating by sight of land and the distant stars, on a route plied by sailors. For centuries, its destination is mainland Greece, the realm of a proud and warlike people the Egyptians called the Achaeans, but who we know as the Mycenaeans. Here, the world feels different. The open, mercantile spirit of Ugarit is replaced by an atmosphere of martial power and rigid control. Society is dominated by great citadels, fortresses like Mycenae and Pylos, built with colossal stones that future generations would believe were placed by giants. Within these walls lives the king, the Wainax, a central authority whose power reaches into every corner of his subjects' lives. He is a warrior king, but also a CEO, the master of a highly organized, top-down palace economy. The tin and copper are brought to the palace workshops, and here the final transformation takes place. Under the careful watch of palace overseers, smiths melt the metals and cast them into their final forms. They produce helmets shaped like a boar's tusk and suits of bronze plate armor that encase a warrior from neck to knee. They forge swords and spearheads by the thousand. But they also create delicate drinking cups, ornate ceremonial daggers inlaid with gold, and massive cauldrons that serve as symbols of the Wainax's wealth. Every item is recorded, every worker accounted for, every ration of barley distributed, all noted down on clay tablets in a script we call Linear B. Nothing happens outside the palace's view. The Wainax controls the bronze, and by controlling the bronze, he controls his world. This rigid, hierarchical system is immensely strong, but its strength depends entirely on the unbroken flow of raw materials from the outside world. The king, in his mighty fortress, is powerful, but he is also a captive, dependent on that donkey caravan that began its journey so many thousands of miles away. This dependence connects the Mycenaean king to a fraternity of other powerful rulers. This is perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the age, the creation of a great family of nations, an exclusive club of kings who ruled the known civilized world. The great powers of the time, the Pharaoh of Egypt, the great king of the Hittites in Anatolia, the king of Babylonia in Mesopotamia, and others saw each other as equals. We know this because we have their letters. Discovered in the sands of Egypt at a place called Amarna, this collection of diplomatic correspondence reveals a world of stunning complexity, written on clay tablets in Akkadian, the international language of the day. These letters show us kings negotiating treaties, arranging diplomatic marriages, and complaining about the quality of gifts. The king of Babylonia writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt to complain that his envoys were robbed and that the Pharaoh, as their host, is responsible for their safety. The Hittite king arranges a marriage between his son and an Egyptian princess to seal a peace treaty, the very first in recorded history, a treaty whose text still survives today. They address each other as brother. To my brother, the king of Egypt, a letter begins, "May all be well with you, with your house, your wives, and your armies." They exchange lavish gifts, gold, chariots, skilled artisans, and precious oils. This was more than just trade. It was a carefully managed system of prestige and mutual obligation. To be a part of this great powers club was to have access to the wealth and resources of the entire network. but it was also to be bound by its rules. This intricate dance of diplomacy kept the peace for generations. It created a balance of power that allowed for unprecedented stability and prosperity. For the kings and queens, the princes and scribes who lived within it, the system felt permanent. It felt like the natural order of the world. It was a magnificent creation, a testament to human ingenuity and cooperation. It was a gilded cage, offering protection and splendor to all who lived within its bars. But a cage, even one made of gold, is still a prison. And its strength is only as great as its weakest bar. Towards the end of the 13th century, before the Common Era, the gilded cage began to show the first signs of strain. The signs were small at first, easily missed amid the grandeur of the age. They were whispers on the wind, small notes of anxiety in the confident chorus of kings. From the Hittite court, a letter from the queen, Puduapa, makes an unusual and urgent request to the Pharaoh of Egypt. It is not for gold or for soldiers, but for something far more basic. Grain. I have no grain in my lands, she writes. It is a startling admission of weakness from a mighty empire. Somewhere in the vast, fertile plains of Anatolia, the rains had failed. From the archives at Ugarit, we find tablets recording the price of wheat. Over a period of several decades, the price climbs higher and higher, a clear indicator of growing scarcity. Other tablets speak of a new menace at sea. Pirates, a persistent nuisance, seem to be growing bolder. A letter from the King of Cyprus warns the merchants of Ugarit about pirate ships that raid the coast, disrupting the vital flow of trade. In Greece, at the same time, the rulers of the Mycenaean citadels begin to reinforce their walls, expand their fortifications, and, most tellingly, build new underground passages to secure their water supplies. They were preparing for a siege. These were isolated incidents, a drought in one kingdom, a pirate raid in another, a flicker of fear in a distant citadel. To the great kings on their thrones, they may have seemed like ordinary problems, the routine challenges of ruling. They did not know, they could not have known, that these were not separate problems. They were symptoms of a much deeper sickness. They were the first tremors, the first faint cracks appearing in the bars of the gilded cage, signaling the start of a catastrophic failure that would bring their entire world to ruin. The age of bronze was coming to an end, and an age of darkness was about to begin. A great structure does not fail all at once. Before the final, catastrophic collapse, there are moments of stress, tiny fissures that spread in silence, unseen from the surface. A great tree may stand for 1,000 years, its leaves green and its branches reaching for the sky, while its roots are slowly rotting away in the darkness below. So it was with the world of the Bronze Age. The gilded cage, for all its outward splendor, was beginning to corrode from within. The whispers of trouble we heard at the end of the last century were growing into a chorus of distress, fueled by forces far greater and more relentless than any king or army. The first of these great forces was an enemy that could not be met. On the battlefield, it was an enemy in the sky, in the soil, and in the empty granaries of the great palaces. It was the slow, creeping death of a changing climate, for reasons we are only now beginning to understand through the study of ancient ice core and the pollen trapped in lakebed sediment. The climate of the eastern Mediterranean began to shift. The reliable winter rains that had sustained agriculture for millennia grew scarce. The summers grew longer, hotter, and drier. What began as a single bad harvest became a string of them. This was not a normal drought. It was a megadrought. climatic shift that lasted for decades, perhaps even generations, in the heartland of the Hittite Empire. On the vast Anatolian plateau, the effects were devastating. The rolling plains that had once been the breadbasket of the kingdom began to turn to dust. The great state granaries, designed to store years of surplus grain for times of need, were slowly emptied and were not being refilled. We can hear the desperation in the voices of the Hittite kings. They wrote not of conquests or of glory, but of survival. They pleaded with the wealthy city of Ugarit to send them ships filled with grain. They begged the Pharaoh of Egypt, their old rival, to send them food to keep their people from starving. The masters of the chariot, the conquerors of Kadesh, were reduced to begging for bread. Imagine a farmer in a small village, looking to the sky for a cloud that never comes. Imagine him watching his crops wither and die in the field. His loyalty to a distant king in a glorious capital means little when his family is hungry. Famine is the mother of chaos. It dissolves the bonds of society. Farmers abandon their lands, either migrating in search of food or turning to banditry, preying on the very trade caravans that were the lifeblood of the empire. The state, unable to feed its people or secure its roads, began to lose its authority. The mighty Hittite Empire was being hollowed out, its foundations eroded by hunger. This silent, creeping catastrophe was not confined to Anatolia. Across the Aegean, in the lands of the Mycenaeans, the same story was unfolding. Analysis of the rings of ancient trees from this period shows them growing closer and closer together, a clear sign of a land starved of water. The great palace system of the Wainaks was a marvel of centralized control, but it was also a brittle monopoly. The king owned the land, controlled the harvests, and redistributed the food. When the harvests repeatedly failed, the system broke. The people in the villages and towns who depended on the palace for their rations were left with nothing. Their faith in the Wainaks, their godlike king, would have been shaken to its core. How could a king who could not provide bread be trusted to provide security? As the land starved, the earth itself began to tremble. The region from Greece to the Levant is a place where continents collide, a fractured landscape riddled with geologic faults. It has always been a land of earthquakes. But the evidence from this period suggests something more terrifying. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of dozens of ancient cities have found a common story: toppled walls, crushed skeletons, and thick layers of ash from fires that broke out after the shaking. What is most startling is that many of these destructions appear to have happened within the same narrow window of time, a period of just a few decades. This has led some geologists to propose the theory of an earthquake storm. An earthquake on one fault line can increase the stress on another, creating a cascading sequence of powerful tremors that ripple across a region over time. Imagine the psychological terror. One city is leveled. A few years later, another one, 100 miles away, meets the same fate. The world itself seemed to be coming apart. The very ground beneath their feet, the most stable and certain thing in their world, could no longer be trusted. A city might survive a single earthquake. Its people could rebuild. But what if that city was already weakened by famine? What if its stores of food were destroyed in the collapse of a granary? What if its harbor was ruined, cutting off its access to trade? What if its great defensive walls, the pride of its king, now lay in a heap of rubble? A great earthquake does not just destroy buildings. It shatters a society's resilience, its ability to cope with the next crisis. And the next crisis was always coming. The weakened, shaken cities were now vulnerable, their gates fragile, their people demoralized. The drought and the earthquakes sent shockwaves through the third great pillar of the Bronze Age world, its intricate system of trade. The globalized economy of the Gilded Cage was a marvel of efficiency, but its complexity was its greatest weakness. Each part of the system depended on every other part functioning perfectly. When the links in the chain began to break, the entire network started to unravel. The Mycenaean smith, in his workshop, could not forge a sword if the tin shipment was delayed by pirates. He could not even light his forge if the olive groves that produced the oil for fuel had withered from the drought. The Hittite king could not field an army if he could not trade his silver for the copper of Cyprus. The pharaoh could not build a new temple if the ships carrying cedar wood from Lebanon were smashed in their port by a tsunami following an earthquake. This was a systems collapse. It was a domino effect on an international scale. When the Hittite state weakened, it could no longer police the roads, so banditry increased. This made the tin caravan's journey even more perilous, causing shortages in the workshops of the Aegean. When harvests failed, kingdoms that once exported grain now hoarded it, causing starvation in the lands that depended on them. The trust that had bound the great kings' club together evaporated, replaced by suspicion and desperation. Treaties were broken. Borders were closed. The letters between brothers ceased. Each kingdom, each city, found itself isolated, cut off from the network that had given it life. The world was spiraling into a vortex of chaos. Famine led to migration and rebellion. Earthquakes shattered defenses and morale. The breakdown of trade crippled industries and armies. The complex, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was collapsing under its own weight. The Gilded Cage had become a death trap. The great kings in their palaces, who had believed they were the masters of their world, found that they were powerless against these converging catastrophes. Their authority, built on the promise of stability and prosperity, was crumbling along with their palace walls. The world was sick. It was starving, it was broken, and it was afraid. It was a world ripe for the taking. And on the horizon, beyond the edge of the wind-dark sea, new movements of people were beginning. They were not an army of conquest in the traditional sense. They were something new, something born of the chaos itself. They were the desperate, the displaced, the hungry, all set in motion by the unraveling of the world. The storm had been gathering for a century, and now it was about to break. A world weakened by hunger and shaken by the trembling of the earth is a world like a dry forest in the height of summer. It is a tinderbox, waiting only for a spark to erupt into a storm of fire. For the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, that spark came not from the sky, nor from the ground beneath them, but from the sea. The chaos that had been brewing for decades, the desperation of starving farmers, and the restlessness of broken kingdoms had finally coalesced into a new and terrifying force. A great migration had begun. The Egyptians, who watched this phenomenon with growing dread from their borders, gave the migrants a simple, chilling name: the Sea Peoples. They were not a single nation, nor a unified army with a single king. They were a loose confederation of displaced peoples, a torrent of humanity set in motion by the crises of the age. Their names are strange to us, echoes of forgotten tribes: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Danaan, the Weshesh. Some may have been former Mycenaeans, their own kingdoms in ashes. Others may have come from Anatolia, fleeing the collapsing Hittite state. Still others may have sailed from the islands of the central Mediterranean. Like Sicily or Sardinia, their own lands afflicted by the same great drought. They were a symptom of the sickness that had gripped the world, a fever dream come to life. They traveled not just as warriors, but as entire nations afloat. Their sleek warships, with their distinctive bird-headed prows, were accompanied by heavy, round-hulled merchant ships and crude barges. On these vessels were their families, their women and children, their elderly. On land, they moved with cumbersome ox carts, piled high with their worldly possessions. This was not a raid for plunder. This was a search for a new home, a final, desperate gamble for survival by people who had lost everything. And they were willing to burn down the entire world to find a place to live. The tide of fire swept, first across the rich and prosperous coast of the Levant. For the clearest, most heart-wrenching view of the apocalypse, we look to the city of Ugarit. The king of Ugarit, a man named Amerope, suddenly found his prosperous, cosmopolitan city on the front line of a war for existence. We can trace the city's final days through the clay tablets he left behind. The first messages are urgent, but not yet desperate. He receives word from a general in the field that an enemy fleet has been sighted. He writes to the neighboring king of Alasia, on the island of Cyprus, pleading for intelligence and assistance. The reply from Alasia is grim, confirming that enemy ships are indeed sacking the coast. Then the tone shifts to pure panic. The main Hittite army, the city's sworn protector, is far away to the north, fighting its own battles. It cannot help. Amerope receives a letter from one of his own commanders, a man watching the coast. The report is stark. The enemy ships are here. Another letter, a plea for help from a desperate official, contains the terrible line, "Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it." The most poignant artifact of all was found in a kill, where clay tablets were baked to make them permanent. It was a letter from King Amerope, a reply to the king of Alasia. It had been written in the final hours, but it was never sent. The fire that destroyed Ugarit baked the tablet in its kill, preserving the king's last words for eternity. "My father," he wrote, "behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? The country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it." With those words, the king of Ugarit tells us everything. His armies were sent away to defend his Hittite overlords, leaving his own home defenseless. The complex web of alliances, the very thing that was supposed to guarantee his safety, had become his death sentence. The gilded cage had slammed shut. Sometime shortly after that letter was written, the enemy breached the walls. The fires that consumed the city's grand temples and sprawling palaces were so hot they melted stone. The great trading hub, the crossroads of the world, fell silent forever. The fate of Ugarit's protectors, the mighty Hittite Empire, was no less terrible. Their end is shrouded in more mystery, a silent and sudden disappearance from the stage of history. We know their last king, Superluliuma II, was aware of the growing threat from the sea. He boasted in an inscription of winning a great naval victory against the ships of Alasia. Perhaps it gave his people a moment of hope, a belief that the empire could weather this storm as it had so many others. It was a false hope. Not long after this supposed victory, the central government of the Hittite Empire simply ceased to exist. The great capital, Hattusa, a city of towering stone walls and 100 temples, was violently destroyed. The gates were smashed, the palaces and archives were put to the torch, and the city was abandoned never to be inhabited again. There are no letters from the last king of the Hittites describing his final moments. There are no chronicles of the city's fall. There is only a profound and unsettling silence. The entire, complex civilization, with its unique language, its intricate laws, and its powerful gods, vanished so completely that for the next 3,000 years, it was thought to be a mere legend from the pages of the Old Testament. The empire did not just fall, it evaporated across the Aegean Sea. The same tide of fire was crashing against the shores of Greece. The mighty citadels of the Mycenaean warlords, built to withstand any siege, fell one by one. At Pylos, the beautifully decorated palace of the legendary King Nestor was burned to the ground. In the ruins, archaeologists found the palace archives, the Linear B tablets baked hard by the fire. The final records are not of harvests or tribute, but of frantic military preparations. They speak of watchers guarding the coast. They record the requisition of bronze to be turned into spearheads and arrow points. They note the disposition of naval and land units. The palace was preparing for an invasion from the sea. Clearly, it was not enough who delivered the final blow. Was it the sea peoples sweeping in from the east? Or was it an internal explosion of violence? Perhaps the starving commoners who had suffered for decades under the heel of the Wainaks rose up in a bloody rebellion. Or perhaps, in the chaos of a collapsing world, the Mycenaean kingdoms turned on each other in a final, desperate war for dwindling resources. The answer is likely a combination of all these things. The system was so broken that it devoured itself. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The great palaces were burned, their treasures looted, their rulers killed. With their destruction, the specialized knowledge of the palace scribes was lost. The ability to read and write vanished from Greece for 4 centuries. It was a cultural catastrophe, a great forgetting. From Anatolia to Greece, from the Levant to Cyprus, the old world was gone. A wave of destruction had washed over the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, leaving behind a landscape of smoldering ruins and ghost cities. The entire international system, so carefully constructed over centuries, had been wiped out in a few short decades. But the tide of fire had not yet fully receded. The great wave of destruction, having shattered every other kingdom in its path, was now gathering its strength, and it was rolling south towards the oldest, richest, and most powerful kingdom. Of them all, the last great bastion of the Bronze Age world, the final remnant of the gilded cage, was the land of the pharaohs, and Egypt now stood alone. The tide of fire, having consumed the world, now broke upon the shores of the Nile Delta. To the west lay a graveyard of fallen empires. To the north, a sea churning with displaced peoples. To the east, a desert haunted by restless tribes. In all the known world, only one of the old kingdoms remained. Only one of the great brothers of the Gilded Age was still standing, Egypt. For 2,000 years, the kingdom of the two lands had been the very definition of permanence. Its monumental temples and tombs were built for eternity. Its society was anchored by the predictable rhythms of the Nile, and its pharaoh was a god on earth. Protected by vast deserts, it had endured invasions, droughts, and internal rebellions before. But this was different. This was not a rival empire seeking to conquer a province. This was a storm of chaos seeking to swallow the world. On the throne, in the great city of Thebes, sat a man named Ramesses III. He was a new pharaoh of a new dynasty, but he carried the weight of all the centuries of Egyptian glory on his shoulders. He would have received the news from his envoys and spies with growing horror. A clay tablet found in the ruins of U was a letter addressed to an Egyptian official, a last desperate plea for help that never arrived. Ramesses knew the Hittites were gone. He knew the cities of the Levant were ash. He knew that the enemy was not a disciplined army he could meet in a formal battle of chariots, but something more elemental, a human flood driven by desperation. He knew that Egypt was the last prize. He gathered the armies of Upper and Lower Egypt, conscripting every man he could. He ordered the forges to produce thousands of new weapons. He fortified the garrisons along his eastern frontier, and he prepared his fleet for a battle that would decide the fate of his civilization. The story of this final, epic struggle is not pieced together from scattered fragments. Ramesses III made sure of that. On the west bank of the Nile, across from the temples of Karnak, he built his own grand mortuary temple, a monument we call Medinet, Habu. And on its towering stone walls, he carved a history book in stone. In enormous, detailed reliefs and long hieroglyphic inscriptions, he told the story of his great war. A piece of masterful propaganda designed to ensure that his victory would never be forgotten. It is from these walls that our narrative is now drawn. The first assault came by land. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu tell us that no land could stand before their arms. The wave of migrants, with their warriors leading the way and their families trailing behind in heavy ox carts, had swept down the coast through the ruins of the Levant. They now crashed against Egypt's eastern border. Ramesses met them with the full might of the Egyptian army. It was a clash of two different worlds. On one side were the Sea Peoples, a chaotic confederation of tribes, each with their own style of fighting. The reliefs show the distinctive feathered headdresses of the Peleset and the horned helmets and round shields of the Shurdan. They were fierce, individualistic warriors. On the other side was the disciplined, well-oiled military machine of Egypt. Lines of archers fired volley after volley into the advancing horde. Squadrons of chariots, the heavy cavalry of the Bronze Age, smashed into their flanks, sowing terror and confusion. The land battle was a bloody, brutal affair, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Egyptian army held. The land invasion was broken, but the Sea Peoples had not played their final card. Their greatest strength lay in their ships. While their land forces were being repulsed at the frontier, their main fleet sailed directly for the great artery of Egypt, the mouth of the Nile River itself. If they could force their way into the delta, they could sail directly into the heart of the kingdom, bypassing its land defenses entirely. It was a bold strategy, and it led to the decisive confrontation of the war. Ramesses knew that his own sailors were no match for the Sea Peoples in open water. So he laid a trap. He allowed the enemy fleet to sail unopposed into the mouths of the Nile. The narrow, tangled channels of the delta were familiar territory to the Egyptians, but a confusing maze for the invaders. Their ships, packed tightly together, lost all advantage of speed and maneuverability. Then the trap was sprung. From the reeds along the riverbanks, legions of Egyptian archers rose up and unleashed a storm of arrows. The sky went dark with projectiles, raining down upon the decks of the trapped ships. At the same time, the Egyptian fleet, which had been hiding in the side channels, emerged to block any escape. It was not a battle of seamanship, it was a slaughter. The Egyptian reliefs show a scene of utter chaos. Egyptian marines used grappling hooks to snag the enemy vessels, dragging them closer to be boarded. They swarmed over the sides, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Egyptian ships capsized the smaller enemy boats, sending their occupants into the crocodile-infested waters of the Nile. The river, The source of all life in Egypt ran red with the blood of their enemies. The victory was absolute. Ramesses' inscriptions are triumphant. Their hearts are taken, their souls have flown, he boasted. Those who reached my frontier, their seed is not. Egypt was saved. The tide of fire had been turned back at the very gates of the kingdom. Ramesses III was hailed as a savior. The pharaoh who had single-handedly held back the darkness that had consumed everyone else. But as the celebrations faded, the true cost of this victory became terrifyingly clear. The war had been ruinously expensive. The treasury was empty. The army was stretched thin, guarding a new class of prisoners of war. Thousands of captured sea peoples who now had to be fed and settled. Many were conscripted into the Egyptian army as mercenaries. Others, like the Peleset, were settled in fortified towns in Canaan, the land we now know as Palestine, where they would become the Philistines, a thorn in Egypt's side for centuries to come. More importantly, Egypt had lost its empire. The rich cities of the Levant that had paid tribute in gold, silver, and cedar wood for 3 centuries were now either destroyed or in the hands of new peoples. Egypt was now isolated, cut off from the international trade that had made it wealthy. The gilded cage was gone, and Egypt now found itself alone in a poorer, more dangerous, and more fragmented world. The proof of this decline is found not in the grand inscriptions of a temple, but in a humble papyrus document during the reign of Ramesses III, the savior of Egypt. The state for the first time failed to deliver the monthly grain rations to the highly skilled artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not slaves, but respected state employees. In response, they did something unprecedented in human history. They laid down their tools and went on strike. "We are hungry," their leader declared to the panicked officials. The fact that the pharaoh, who could defeat the sea peoples, could not afford to pay the men building his own eternal resting place speaks volumes. The economic and political structures of the new kingdom were rotting from within. Ramesses III would live on for several more years, ruling from his palace, surrounded by the magnificent stone carvings of his glorious victory. But it was a hollow glory. He had won the battle, but he had lost the world. He had saved the body of Egypt, but its golden age was over. He had become the king of a diminished kingdom, the wounded survivor of a shipwreck, clinging to a piece of driftwood while the rest of the fleet had sunk beneath the waves. The great light of the Bronze Age had not been extinguished entirely, but it had been reduced to a single, flickering candle in a vast and gathering darkness. The storm had passed. The great armies no longer marched, the fleets of raiders no longer haunted the coasts, and the fires of burning cities no longer lit up the night sky. But the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The vibrant, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was gone, and in its place was a landscape of ruins. A world fractured into 1,000 isolated pieces. What followed the dramatic collapse was, in many ways, even more profound, a deep and prolonged period of darkness, a great forgetting that would last for centuries. Imagine walking through the ruins of a once mighty Mycenaean citadel like Tyrannus, or Pylos, a generation after its fall. The colossal stone walls, once a symbol of invincible power, are now blackened by fire and choked with weeds. The grand central hall, the Megaron, where the Wainacs once held court and poets sang of the deeds of heroes, is now open to the sky, its brightly painted frescoes peeling and fading in the sun and rain. The paved roads are cracked and uneven. The workshops of the bronze smiths and the potters are filled with debris and the bones of small animals. But the most significant change is not in the stones, but in the people. A few families might be living in makeshift huts built against the old walls, like squatters in the ruins of a forgotten empire. They are farmers and herders, their lives focused on the simple, immediate needs of survival. If you were to ask them who built these immense walls, they would not know. They might tell you stories of giants, the Cyclopes, who were the only beings strong enough to lift such stones. They have lost the memory of their own ancestors. The complex, hierarchical society of the Wainacs has vanished. There is no king, no scribes, no tax collectors, no standing army. The population has plummeted, by some estimates, as much as 90% in certain regions of Greece. The great cities are gone, and the landscape is now one of small, impoverished, and isolated villages. The most devastating loss was the loss of knowledge. The linear B script, that intricate system of writing used to manage every aspect of the palace economy, had been the exclusive tool of a small class of professional scribes. When the palaces burned, the scribes disappeared, and the knowledge of writing died with them. For the next 400 years, no one in Greece could read or write. It is a staggering thought. For centuries of illiteracy, all the histories, the economic records, the religious texts, the very memory of their own civilization were wiped clean. It was a cultural reset on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The stories of the great heroes of the Bronze Age, of Agamemnon and Achilles, survived only as oral poems, passed down from one generation of bards to the next, becoming more myth than history with each retelling. This darkness was not confined to Greece. In Anatolia, the former heartland of the Hittite Empire was now a patchwork of small, competing kingdoms and tribal territories. The grand imperial capital of Hattusa lay empty, a ghost city slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The sophisticated, cuneiform writing of the Hittites, along with their distinct Indo-European language, fell into disuse and was forgotten. The complex legal codes, the rich mythology, the detailed historical annals of 1,000 years of empire, all vanished into silence. Even in the lands that had once been the bustling coast of the Levant, the lights had gone out. The ruins of Ugarit were never reoccupied. Other great trading cities were reduced to impoverished shadows of their former selves. The old international sea lanes, once highways of commerce carrying copper, tin, and luxury goods, were now mostly empty. Piracy was rampant. Long-distance trade shriveled. A village might now produce its own crude pottery, rather than importing the finely crafted wares that had once been common. Each community turned inward, forced to become self-sufficient in a world where neighbors were more likely to be threats than trading partners. The world had become smaller, poorer, and more disconnected. A farmer in Greece, a herdsman in Anatolia, and a fisherman on the Levantin coast no longer lived in the same world, even if they were unaware of it. The grand narrative that had connected them, the shared system of the gilded cage, had been shattered. Life became local. The horizon shrank. The concerns of most people were no longer about the balance of power between great kings, but about whether the harvest would be enough to survive the winter, or whether a neighboring tribe would raid their village. This was the true legacy of the collapse. It was not just the destruction of buildings, but the destruction of complexity itself. The intricate systems of administration, diplomacy, and international trade that had taken centuries to build were simply too fragile to survive the perfect storm of crises. When they broke, humanity was thrown back to a simpler, more primitive state of existence. It was an age of warlords and chieftains, not of kings and emperors. It was an age of iron, not because iron was superior, but because the ingredients for bronze, which required international trade, were no longer available. Iron ore was plentiful everywhere, a democratic metal for a more fragmented age. For generations, this was the state of the world. A long silence descended upon the lands that had once been the heart of civilization. It was a time of immense struggle and hardship, but it was not an end. In the quiet darkness of this long winter, new seeds were beginning to stir in the soil. The destruction of the old, rigid, palace-dominated world, as traumatic as it was, had also created an open space. It cleared the ground for new peoples, new technologies, and new ideas to emerge. The silence was not the silence of death, but the quiet before a new and different kind of dawn. The world of the god-kings was gone forever, but the world of man was about to begin. In the natural world, a great forest fire is an event of terrifying destruction. It consumes the old growth, sweeps away the underbrush, and leaves behind a landscape of black and grey silence. But this act of destruction is also an act of creation. The fire returns nutrients to the soil, and the newly cleared ground, now open to the sunlight, allows for a burst of new life. Seeds that have lain dormant for years, unable to compete in the crowded, shadowy forest, now have their chance to sprout. The collapse of the Bronze Age world was just such a fire. For all the terror of its passing and the long cold winter that followed, it cleared the ground for a new world to grow, a world that would be, in many ways, more dynamic, more resilient, and more human. The first green shoots of this new world were forged in iron. The age of bronze had been defined by its reliance on a metal that was inherently elitist. Bronze required copper and, more critically, tin, a rare resource that had to be imported over immense distances. This meant that only the great kings and their palace economies could control the supply. Bronze was the metal of the state, of the chariot warrior, of a rigid, top-down hierarchy. Iron, by contrast, was the metal of the people. Iron ore is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust. It could be found almost anywhere. The complex international trade networks were no longer needed. A single village could have its own mine, its own smelter, its own blacksmith. The first iron tools and weapons were often crude, not as strong as the expertly crafted bronze they replaced, but they were available. And as smiths perfected the techniques of carburizing and quenching, they unlocked the secret to making steel, a material far superior to bronze. An iron plow could break tougher soils than a bronze one, opening up new lands for farming. An iron axe could clear forests more efficiently, and an iron sword in the hands of a common foot soldier could stand against the bronze-clad champions of the old world. The rise of iron was a technological revolution that helped break the old monopolies of power and empowered smaller, more self-sufficient communities. With the old empires gone, a power vacuum emerged on the world stage. This vacuum allowed new peoples to flourish. The most successful of these were the descendants of the Canaanite city-states of the Levant, a people we know as the Phoenicians. Having witnessed the destruction of their powerful neighbors, the Phoenicians learned a crucial lesson. True power did not have to come from vast armies and territorial conquest. It could come from the sea. They became the great sailors, merchants, and explorers of this new age. Their ships, more advanced than any that had come before, ventured out from their home cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus, re-establishing the old trade routes and pushing into seas the Bronze Age sailors had never dared to enter. They were not building an empire of land, but an empire of trade routes and colonies. They founded new cities like Carthage in North Africa and sailed past the Pillars of Hercules into the vast Atlantic Ocean. They were the new connectors, the weavers of a new and more flexible network. And in the course of their travels, driven by the practical need for a simple and efficient way to keep their commercial records, they either perfected or popularized the single most important intellectual invention of the age, the alphabet. The writing systems of the Bronze Age, like cuneiform and linear B, were incredibly complex, requiring hundreds of symbols and years of dedicated study. They were the exclusive domain of a professional scribal class. The Phoenician alphabet, by contrast, was a work of pure genius in its simplicity. It used just 22 symbols, each representing a consonant sound. A merchant or a sea captain could learn the entire system in a matter of weeks. For the first time in history, literacy was no longer the sole property of the palace or the temple. It was a tool available to almost anyone. This simple invention spread like wildfire. The Greeks adopted it, adding symbols for vowels, making it even more flexible. The Etruscans in Italy learned it from the Greeks, and they, in turn, passed it on to the Romans. The alphabet you are reading at this very moment is a direct descendant of those symbols first carried across the sea on Phoenician merchant ships. The democratization of knowledge that the alphabet unleashed would change the human story forever. Nowhere was this change more profound than in Greece. After 4 centuries of darkness, a new culture began to stir. As villages grew into towns, they did not resurrect the old model of the Wainax and his palace. Instead, they experimented with something entirely new, the polis, or the city-state. Because there was no memory of a god-king, they were free to invent new ways of organizing themselves. They began to think not as subjects, but as citizens, individuals who had a stake, a voice, and a responsibility in the governance of their community. It was in the fertile ground of the Greek polis that the radical ideas of democracy, philosophy, civic law, and political science were born. Using their newly acquired alphabet, they wrote down the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which looked back at the lost Bronze Age as a distant, mythical age of heroes. The memory of the collapse had been transformed into the founding myth of a new civilization. The world of Achilles and Agamemnon was gone, but the world of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle was just beginning. And so, the long silence was broken by the clang of the iron forge, the splash of the Phoenician oar, and the thoughtful debates in the agora of the Greek city-state. The destruction of the Bronze Age, as total and terrifying as it was not an ending. It was a violent and painful transformation. It taught a bitter lesson, that complexity is fragile, that even the most glorious civilizations are not immune to collapse, and that no system is eternal. The story of that lost world serves as a distant mirror for our own. We too live in a complex, globalized society, dependent on intricate supply chains and a stable climate. We too face the challenges of environmental change, resource scarcity, and the mass movements of peoples. The echoes of the Bronze Age collapse are a quiet but persistent reminder that the gilded cage we have built for ourselves, for all its technological splendor, requires constant vigilance to maintain. The embers of that ancient fire serve to illuminate our own path, reminding us that from the greatest endings can come the most unexpected new beginnings, and that the ultimate story of humanity is one of resilience, of rebirth, and of the endless, unquenchable dawn that always follows the darkest night. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.